Okay, and then I would like to ask our first speaker, Susan Pickford from the University of Geneva, to share her screen. She will be talking about neural machine translation and into English, genre fiction translation, and she's asking the question whether it's a threat or an opportunity. Susan, over to you.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present. So I'm talking about neural machine translation today and into English genre fiction translation, and I'm trying to determine roughly in 20 minutes whether it's a threat or an opportunity. So as we just heard from Antonio Toral, this is a really burgeoning field of research at the minute, but studies so far have tended to focus on the capacity of neural machine translation to produce acceptable renditions of works that are relatively high in literary capital or have strong author function. So what I want to look at today is what happens when you use NMT to translate genre fiction with low literary capital, low cultural legitimacy, and weak author function. And I'm taking chick lit as the starting point for this exploration of how NMT might impact this area and the implications that might have for professional translation careers, and in turn, the implications that might have on how postgraduate literary translation courses might be able to future-proof their training for students. So my PowerPoint is being a bit slow, but it should be okay. So chick lit, the genre I'm looking at today, is generally traced back to Helen Fielding's Bridget Jones's Diary and Candice Bushnell's Sex and the City, both early 1990s. The genre is strongly characterized by textual features, including humor, irony, and pop culture references. And it also has a very strong paratextual identity in terms of cover design in particular. And while literary translators are often framed as the sole creative agents involved in the translation process, this overlooks the fact that translators actually work within an editorial chain of command. And this is what I'm looking at partly today. Non-canonical fiction of the sort I'm looking at, genre fiction, is particularly rich in editorial interventions. As this slide demonstrates, this is an example of developmental editing for a genre fiction novel. And as the authors of the chick lit writing manual, C. Jane Wright, point out, chick lit books are often acquired by publishers on the basis of a simple a synopsis of a few pages. And then the book is written, and as it's written, it's subjected to significant developmental editing hand in hand with the publisher. So I think that this process of developmental editing, together with the genre's strong paratextual identity, really points at a genre that has relatively low author function, where by and large, and with a few exceptions, readers choose books but largely on the basis of the genre attribution rather than the identity of the individual author. I mean, these are books that are given away free on magazine covers. So there's very little identification with a particular author. I want to show you now a general timeline for into English chick lit translations. There's actually a lot more of it than you might think going on. And what I want to show you here with this timeline is the advent of Amazon Crossing, which in 2015 invested $10 million in the translation, the genre translation field, and has really made a significant contribution to establishing something like a professional, sort of in the Bourdieusian sense, field of practice into English genre fiction translation. Now, Amazon Crossing only publishes ebooks, which means that it's kind of gone under the radar in terms of research, despite the fact that it now accounts for about 10% of all into English fiction translation, which is a considerably higher proportion than any other publisher. It has, though, had a huge and a very big impact on the field, and has done much more than any other recent initiative, in my opinion, to bring literary translation into English into mainstream book consumption. Its books regularly sell in the hundreds of thousands. Its bestseller, Oliver Pötzsch's Hangman's Daughter series, has sold over 1.5 million copies. There are a number of other examples I could give you. So here, in terms of sheer productivity, it means that into English fiction translators, for example, Owen Weitzman, who translates Finnish crime fiction for the imprint, have been able to attain ongoing professional practice, levels of ongoing professional practice that have long been the standard in other language markets. Weitzman, for example, has translated 12 books for the series since 2012, alongside works for other publishers. And this means he's been able to earn a full-time living from literary translation practice for the best part of a decade at this point. And this situation is really akin to a professional literary translation practice outside the Anglosphere, where high levels of ongoing professional practice, even waged employment for literary translation, is not that unusual. For example, when Harlequin, who published Mills and Boon's novels, moved into the Japanese market, they hired 400 full-time English to Japanese translators. So I wanted to look at a cohort of the people who are doing these translations, and you've got a little bit of data here. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the sort of profile of the people who are doing this work suggests really two things to me. First of all, it's actually a lot easier to make a full-time living from into English fiction translation than is commonly assumed when you take genre fiction into account. Now, these are highly professionalized translators who are largely overlooked in public literary translation discourse. And I think this has significant implications for professional training courses, where genre fiction is considerably underexplored, despite representing a significant market share. The second point I would like to make based on this slide is that there is actually much more of a continuum between literary and non-literary professional practice than is often assumed. Into English, genre fiction translators are equally as likely to be translating technical content as they are works with higher literary capital. And this suggests to me that they may well therefore already be familiar with CAT tools from their pragmatic translation practice, and therefore open to exploring their advantages in literary translation. So if literary translation is, as many people seem to think, the last translation bastion standing against NMT, does that mean that genre fiction can be seen as the Trojan horse? Well, it's fairly clear, as we saw from Antonio's keynote this morning, that NMT and literary translation is a fast-moving area of research at the minute. The experiments that are the historical experiments in the area have tended to be fairly small in scale, and have drawn on texts that are either old because for practical reasons they're out of copyright and therefore easier to use, so texts like Wuthering Heights, Sherlock Holmes, Daniel Defoe, or texts that have been relatively high in literary capital. So we've seen Camus, Oscar Wilde, James Joyce, etc. The Observatoire de la Traduction Automatique in France looks at literary essays, high-end literary fiction, etc. But all of this means that there has been relatively little problematization so far in the debate of authorial status or of the translator's duty of faithfulness to the original. And I would also say that research has really focused on the potential of NMT rather than the impact of its uptake in the translation sector. So as we've just seen, even in the types of high status literary texts that NMT has been tested on, it really has made amazing progress. And there are experiments underway to build literary corpora for NMT training. I'm thinking here, for example, of Damien Ansen, who is working on a PhD in Grenoble, working on a 7-volume cycle of fantasy novels, 6 of which have been translated by a human, and then the 7th he's training with that corpus for a machine. And as we've just seen, so among the stumbling blocks to NMT that have been identified so far, what's going on here? So among the stumbling blocks that have been identified so far, stylometrically speaking, are things like sentence length and complexity. So I just wanted to have a little look at an example of sentence length and complexity in genre fiction translation. I have the greatest admiration for Lee Child. Anyone who can sell that sort of number of books and give that much pleasure to that number of readers, I think, is deserving of plaudits. But it does mean that, you know, these are the sort of textual features that distinguish genre fiction from writing with higher literary capital. And a stylometric study of chick lit by Dutch scholars reveals the same thing, that it uses typically on average shorter sentences, statistically significantly lower levels of subordination, for example, than more overtly literary texts. So I wanted to look at how good a job NMT can do with chick lit. This is a brief sample from one of the texts in my corpus. One of the two that I've given you to look at, one of the two translations into English I've given you is raw NMT. And the other one is the published translation by an early career human translator. This was actually her first published project. So just have a little look at those. And I would argue here that from the literary editor's point of view, they're actually pretty similar, and there are pretty similar amounts of work to be done on each side. So I would say that in the human version, there are at least 3 aspects that I would change here, where we have to badger on. She had always badgered on about Anthony. I think that's sort of mixing up 2 expressions, to bang on about something and to badger someone. A muscle here, I should cling on to him like a muscle, should be a limpet in the English expression. And the and that we have here, blah, 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 and blah, 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 again, I think is relatively unidiomatic. So it seems to me that here, NMT and an early career human are, in fact, relatively evenly matched. So does that mean that genre fiction translators are doomed to lose their future work to computers? Well, not entirely, because for the moment, there are still some textual features that NMT cannot handle very well. As we've just seen, things like humor, irony, wordplay, cultural references are currently beyond scope. So what I think could be useful then is to think of NMT as a support for human translators rather than a straightforward replacement. And I'm thinking here of Silke Luhrmann's recent PhD, which argued that non-fiction translators have to develop their own human USPs. So I think in genre fiction, USP, the human USP could be things like humor and bringing in appropriate cultural references. And this is what I did with that same sample. So as you can see, again, I've rewritten it quite heavily. I've gone quite a long way along the line from translation to adaptation. And the reason I did this is because I was thinking, like Morten Visby, who is the president of the European Council of Literary Translation Councils, genre fiction translators, genre fiction publishers are liable to be actually quite happy with translations that are workable. And so I think really here in this kind of text, you have a considerable degree of flexibility in terms of faithfulness to the original. If your translation is of slightly lower standard, but still workable, the cost of poor quality for publishers in this arena is liable to be relatively small, particularly if the resultant workflow is cheaper and more streamlined, as we've just seen. And in an international publishing landscape, where the SimShip model is becoming increasingly relevant. I'm thinking here of authors like J.K. Rowling, Dan Brown, Michelle Obama. If you need your book to come out quickly, then this is the model that is liable to appeal to some publishers. Furthermore, as Jos Morkens and his co-authors pointed out in a recent paper, the use of post-edited machine translation tends to correlate with text perishability. They add that literary translation is a challenging, long lifespan text type. But I don't think that's always true. Studies have shown that chick lit readers consider the genre as disposable, and some, in fact, even discard the books after using them. So maybe than fearing NMT, we should consider looking at the upsides. Computer technology, as we've just heard, can boost accuracy and productivity. It might enable translators to broaden their business space by working from a wider range of languages. This is a Dutch chick lit novel. What we have here, we obviously have the Dutch original. This is the pure machine translation, the raw NMT. This is my version. I don't speak Dutch, but I do speak German, which is obviously related. So I would be relatively confident about post-editing, accepting a post-editing job using this raw machine translation from a text where I have some access, although not ideal, to the original. So that could be one model that you could look at, working from a broader base of related languages. I think another upside, not specifically related to individual translators, but to the profession as a whole, is in line with the current debate on how best to increase inclusivity of literary translation. Here, I'm going to quote the translator and scholar Corinne Taktiris, who has recently called for the development of an actively anti-racist translation practice. Let's translate Swahili romance novels, she suggests. Now, this is not something that the market is ever going to do on its own. English chick lit has, as we see here, spawned imitations in local languages throughout the world, Dutch, Turkish, and Swahili. And so maybe we could use this as part of this anti-racist translation practice to bring these texts back into English. It could be a useful tool in the armory to bring down barriers to participation in literary translation. This is not going to happen overnight, but developers are working on African language machine translation. Free online translation tools were recently released for Eritrean and Ethiopian, for example, and projects are currently working on tools for Bambara, Setswana, and Zulu, including in other language, as examples of other African languages. So once post-edited, this raw material could offer a low-cost, streamlined, high-volume corrective to the Eurocentric bias of into English translation, increasing the participation of a more diverse population at the same time. And I think that the combination of NMT and post-editing could also potentially reduce another form of exclusion. Priscilla Patatas has demonstrated some of the barriers facing translators living with disabilities. Many others must be excluded from entering the profession in the workplace in the first place. Unemployment rates for individuals with long-standing health issues across Europe are at 50%. But in some ways, this sort of translation is eminently suited for disabled workers. It's a highly flexible form of home working. It's open to adaptive technology such as voice recognition. So adopting NMT could easily allow people living with forms of musculoskeletal disability to work more easily in literary translation. For example, a 2018 study by Morkans and co-authors demonstrated that NMT and post-editing requires considerably less physical input from translators, 32% time saving and 28% fewer keystrokes. Now, this is perhaps a somewhat utopian vision. It would require considerable reconceptualization of literary translation as professional practice, aligning it more with non-literary translation than is currently the case, particularly in the Anglosphere. And it would undoubtedly encounter resistance from stakeholders with a personal investment in the symbolic capital of into English literary translation. Yet, as the case of Harlequin translators in Japan shows, it's by no means unfeasible to treat literary translation as a form of ongoing professional practice or even waged employment. As situated workflow research in literary translation develops, focusing attention increasingly on questions such as how literary translators handle time pressure, how they use technology, the impact of their workplace environment, we're beginning to see a more realistic re-evaluation of the place of translation technology in literary translation careers. recent translation teaching frameworks such as PETRA-E make knowledge of professional practice an integral part of this translator skill set. So I think that the time has really come to take both genre fiction and NMT seriously as part of the Inter-English literary translators stock in trade. Thank you. That's me finished. I'll just close my screen share.
Thank you, Susan, for this insightful look into Chicklit. Let me just see if we have any questions for you. No, we don't, and it is 10:30, so I will just thank you for, no, there's one question. We have time for one question, and the question is, do post editors read the original and know the source language well?
I think in this genre, it hardly matters. I really do not wish to belittle. I mean, I love reading these books. They give a lot of people a huge amount of enjoyment. What I'm trying to sort of show is that you can break, if the text is going to exist as a standalone text in the target language in its own right, its relation to the original when you've got very low author function is not the most significant criterion, I would say. If you're reading it as a standalone book, then it doesn't really matter what the original says if the target text works in its own right as a work of Chicklit.
Okay, thank you very much. We have some more comments in the chat, which I will just ask you to read for yourselves, please, because we are out of time, but there are no questions that remained unanswered. So thanks again very much.